Hi, in this video we are going to look at how to set up metadata ingest form using the web management console. The topics that we will cover include enabling the ingest form, setting up mandatory and optional fields in the ingest form, using the project vault and roles to customize the metadata form. So before you can set up the metadata ingest form, you must enable the ingest form. So head over to the Evolfin web administration console that's typically set up on your hostname :9443 HTTPS URL. Once you get to the web administration console, then go to System, Server Control Panel, click on Repository Settings, and find the setting for enforcing metadata on every check-in. This flag must be turned on, and that's how the ingest form will begin to show up when you bring in assets through the desktop app. If this flag is turned off, like this, and you have defined required or mandatory fields, the ingest form will not show up. So you must turn on this flag and then hit save. Once you do that, the settings are on to enable the ingest forms. Okay, now that the ingest forms are turned on, how do you set up an ingest form with metadata fields? So this is done using the metadata editor. If you have reviewed the video around how to use the metadata editor to create custom metadata fields and groups, then you would have seen how the metadata editor can be used to create required or optional fields. We'll revisit that now. So let us say we have a metadata group called editorial information, and if we come in over here, we can sort by type. So if I sort by type, it shows, for example, here optional, and if I reverse sort, it shows me the fields that have been marked as mandatory. So we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4 fields that are mandatory. So type indicates if the metadata ingest form will show these fields as required or mandatory fields. And optional indicates if a metadata field will even show up in the ingest form. So by default, when you set up the metadata schema, the type is set to none. So if I can pick up one of the fields here, let's say brand, click edit. So this is the most important field to remember, type. And by default, like I said, it is set to none. And if it is set to none, then this field is not going to be visible in the check-in form. By default, the check-in form will show a comment field that is always enabled by default, and that will capture any comments that you want to make when you ingest the files. The type can be used to control if the field is optional or mandatory. Optional field is not a must-have, but will show up in the check-in form, and the mandatory field is something that has to be entered before an ingest will be allowed from the desktop. So we can see there are 4 fields that are marked as mandatory, and there are several optional fields. So to see how this actually works, we can open up the asset browser, the desktop app, and pretend to ingest some files just to show you this concept. So if I try to ingest this camera card in here, I can move over to the ingest form. The top part shows all the files, and here I can see the results of my metadata schema marking these 4 fields as required. So these show up as orange fields, and they must be entered in order to ingest the asset, and the rest of the fields are in white font. That means these are optional fields. So going back to the metadata schema, the fields that were marked in mandatory showed up in orange, and the rest of them showed up as optional fields in white font. And there are lots of other fields that exist here that are not set to optional or mandatory, and these will not show up. Like some of these fields don't have any type. By default, the type is none. So these fields will not show up in the check-in form. So if you want to control whether a certain field will show up in a specific project or vault, you can click on this field and bring up the field editor. Over here, you will see 2 attributes, project and roles. So project really stands for project vault. So for example, this is showing you all the vaults that are accessible in the repository. So if I wanted a field to show up if assets are being ingested into a specific vault, let's say I wanted Evolfin Inc. and Boston Agency to be selected here. That means if I bring in any assets into Evolfin Inc. or Boston Agency, this field is enabled. So this applies to only optional field. By the way, you cannot use a project vault filtering on mandatory metadata fields, only on the optional fields. So this is saying if there's an optional field called brand and I bring it in assets into Evolfin Inc., this field will show up. Same thing with roles. So these are some of the default roles in the system. So say I wanted anybody with a designer role. If they are signed in with a designer role and they are ingesting assets, I want the brand field to always show up in the form. So I can vary the fields based on the roles that the users have. If a user has multiple roles, then it'll basically aggregate all the fields that are accessible to the role. So by default, this is empty. That means a field applies to all the roles. So if I get rid of Evolfin Inc. and Boston Agency, this means the field is universal. Every single ingest form across all the projects, across all the roles will have that field.